to talk about. We're here to enjoy humanism and, you know, go through that. So what we're going to do is Mike Shelton, our secretary, is going to give us a humanist minute. A humanist minute is what humanism means to you type situation, and Mike has been generous enough to give us an update on what he got for us.
Well, thank you. Actually, I'm going to read 4 sentences from the Humanist Manifesto of the American Humanist Association, which goes back 100 years or more. They have tried to distill what is humanism into one page, and even defining humanism in one sentence. So I'm going to quote you 4 sentences from this, but they're long sentences. So rather than just quote them, I'm going to have them up on the board here so you can read them along with me, because it takes a little thought, and it ties right into our speaker today. I'm going to refer to one of the 6 principles or assertions, I guess they are assertions by the humanists of what they believe in. The 5th one, which refers to hope. So let's go to the first sentence here. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life. A progressive philosophy of life that, without supernaturalism, without someone up there steering, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. It's a hell of a long sentence, isn't it? But there it is, one sentence. Is a progressive philosophy of life without supernaturalism affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. So what's personal fulfillment? Let's go to one of the principles. The next, this is the 5th affirmation. There are 6 affirmations in this short manifesto. I urge you, I recommend it. It was rewritten in 2003 by a committee of 21 Nobel laureates and Kurt Vonnegut, and they struggled with every word, obviously. So here it is. The 6th affirmation: humans are social by nature and find meaning in relationships. Well, duh. So humanists long for and strive toward a world of mutual care and concern, free of cruelty and its consequences, where differences are resolved cooperatively without resorting to violence. The joining of individuality, me as an individual, with interdependence enriches our lives, encourages us to enrich the lives of others, and inspires hope of attaining peace, justice, and opportunity for all. So that is, I think, a segue into our speaker, who is going to be talking about hope, the imperative of hope, the moral imperative of hope. So here's our sense, and I want to tell you that, indeed, being here gives me hope and inspires me to hope for attaining peace, justice, and opportunity for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. I believe you dropped your little name tag there. Okay, so as we continue on, next weekend, normally we would have Philosophy Under the Influence, but we got something even better than that. Meeple Fest is coming up next weekend. So if you want a whole weekend long of gaming, community, fellowship, Michelle can tell you all about it, and it's an amazing time. I wish I had more time myself, but unfortunately I work 6 days a week. So check it out. It's going to be a blast. Again, please silence your cell phones and go from there. And then also, out of respect for our speaker, please don't try to keep the conversations down to a minimum. Raise your hand during the presentation. I'll be coming around afterwards. Oh, yes, I forgot one more thing. I'll be coming around afterwards and passing the mic off to people to go from there. The last thing before we get to our introduction here is there is a 25-pound ham in our warming room, and it is for raffle. So if you would like to buy a raffle ticket, it's 1 ticket for $1 or 6 tickets for $5, and then go from there. So I guess we'll do the raffle after the presentation. Oh, yeah, okay. So Kathy will be taking spiral cut ham. It's huge. We can feed a whole bunch of people. So, all right. Oh yes, I wanted to say one last thing here, but I think Mike is going to take the mic from me to do that.
Hey, I wanted to thank everyone who organized and put together and contributed to the blood drive last Sunday. I was here, I was in the Red Cross chair giving blood, and I thought, wow, this is really the ultimate act of humanism. I'm donating blood to someone I don't even know, and I'm never going to know him, but maybe it'll save his life. So thank you for all of you who came, and let's do it again next year. Come next year.
Kathy, we have right here, Barry. Barry is going to. Yeah. So, okay, so today, our Sunday speaker, I'm excited, very excited, to introduce Carly Schorman. And while I get this technology up and running, let's see here, slideshow, start from the beginning. Okay. On a personal note, Carly's a great friend, a great acquaintance, someone to hang out with. She and her husband are just amazing human beings. But I'm going to introduce Carly this morning. Carly Schorman was raised in a dusty stretch of desert not intended for human habitation. She received her undergraduate degree from ASU and her master's degree in philosophy and religion from the California Institute of Integral Studies. She is a published novelist and has written for a number of publications and podcasts. At present, she is a deathcare professional, a member of the Society for Business Ethics, chairperson for the Women in Business Council in Tempe, a panelist at this year's Young Women's Conference, and a current nominee for the Tempe Chamber of Commerce's Businesswoman of the Year. Previous speaking engagements include the American Academy of Religion Western Conference, the Women's International Peace Conference, and several guest spots on podcasts and radio, including NPR's The Show. So please give a warm welcome, HSGP welcome to Carly Schorman.
Just have to talk into it. Hey. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to start by explaining I have a phobia of public speaking. There is a difference between a... Thanks, husband. There is a difference between a fear and a phobia. And with the fear, if you do it enough, the fear goes away. Phobia is with you for life. So if I hyperventilate or pass out, I brought him to resuscitate me. I will not die on this floor. All right. Okay. So we're going to get through this together. All right. So being a humanist in the 21st century can get a little depressing. So I thought we would have a conversation to sort of explore a toolbox for shaping out a personal philosophy that can help individuals hold on to hope in times of despair. Defining optimism as a moral imperative can be the most effective tool in combating the problems of modernity, including things like capitalism, technofeudalism, fascism, and the revocation of civil rights in the United States. So we'll take a brief examination of ethical philosophy through this lens so that we can understand a bit more about the revolutionary power of hope. I promise, this is not going to be a conversation about toxic positivity. This is not one of those chats where I'm going to tell you the secret is the secret. So we'll be moving through some science and philosophy so that we can start thinking about how to shape out a better life and a better future. Apparently, I'm going to go back and forth on this. All right, let's try this. So the slides are largely to guidepost me in case I panic and forget what I'm saying. But I did want to say this is a topic I became very interested in for a number of reasons. But actually, one of them that sparked it was this call made to science fiction writers. So in my off hours, I do enjoy writing a little science fiction, and Ursula K. Le Guin made this call to have writers start to envision a better future, We have so many examples of dystopian novels, ways that we can imagine the world getting worse, but science fiction writers, she charged with trying to think of a better future. So, I also regularly listen to a podcast that asks the question, how do we move past capitalism? And just to say, this isn't gonna be an anti-capitalist tirade. It's just one of those glowing examples that I point to when I say there's a problem with modernity because of the unequal distribution of resources. So I'll harken back to it, but that's not really what I'm here to talk about this time. So he asked the question, how do we move past capitalism? A lot of us can see issues with the society we live in as a result of that economic system, but most people can't imagine a way past it. I mean, really think about it for a minute. How do you see the world evolving past capitalism? Now, it's kind of hard to come up with an answer, but if I asked you, can you imagine the world ending? Everybody can come up with like, we can spend the whole hour just talking about way the world might end, like nuclear warfare, climate collapse, upsetting the food chain. There's all these different ways that we have of thinking, oh yeah, I can see that. But when you try to concretely think, what is on the other side of capitalism and how do we get there? Everybody's like, oh, I'm gonna need more time. So that's kind of where this sort of chain of thought emerged from. But to get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself to orient myself in a larger cultural context. Because when you're trying to understand what someone else is saying or thinking, it's important to understand a little something about their background. So, as Alex mentioned, my degrees are in religion and philosophy. I know every atheist wants to study religion, but now I'm an entrepreneur and a business owner. And that's sort of how my interest in ethical philosophy became focused on ethical business practices. I'm interested in community building, and something I definitely never thought I would say in my entire life is I'm also interested in small-scale farming and homesteading skills. Am I a survivalist or preparing for a world-ending event? No, definitely not that. But I am interested in dismantling technofeudalism as we move further in that direction during this time of late-stage capitalism. So there's a lot to packed in there. We'll get to some of it. But what might be most relevant to this group is a little bit about my religious background. So on my mother's side, she's Jewish. It's where all the jokes come from. Her family came over here from Europe. My grandparents lost most of their family during the Holocaust, just about all of their family. And on the other side, my dad is a pastor's son. So my grandfather was a congregational pastor. Now the great thing about that is there's so many different sects. Within this particular group, they're very open, accepting, and affirming. So you can imagine when I got to grade school and I heard other kids talk about things like what their church opposes, and I was like, wait a minute, are we reading the same book? Because I don't understand where you're coming from on this. So it was just a little bit more about sort of where I emerged from. Because I was taught in my family, it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're a good person. You lead a good life. And oftentimes for us, that meant living a life of service. But I would like to talk about the good life. So if we go back to the Academy of Athens, what is generally considered the foundation of Western thought, we find Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And Aristotle was the one who put forth this idea of living a good life in his writing. And for Aristotle, that meant two important things. It means living a virtuous life, but it also means enjoying your life. And it sounds like from the intro today that we are already aware of that, so I won't try and convince you because it sounds like we're on the same page. So while that might sound simple, live a good life and enjoy your life, those components for a good life are actually really challenging to understand the more you think about them. I mean, first we have to look at what makes a life good, and by that I mean enjoyable. When we're assaulted every day by these unceasing horrors all around us, depression doesn't seem like a mood disorder. it seems like a very natural response to a totally messed up world. So when I say something like, how can we be happy or optimistic? It's like, how can we be happy or optimistic in the world in which we currently live? Which brings me to, and I gotta tell you, he hasn't seen the slides. That brings us to this guy. This is my husband, Mark. When I met this weirdo, I just couldn't figure him out. He was an individual who seemed, oh, thank you. He was an individual who seemed, happy with his life. But he wasn't an idiot. Sure, I mean, he had concerns, like all of us, about things like exploitation, income disparity, and all the other things that keep most of us awake at night in an existential spiral. Like finding yourself in a future where you need to shift someone for water. But he didn't really have that existential dread part. No, this is a happy dude. And the thing is, he's a really smart guy. I remember my father once told me that smart people are just sad. And I took that way more to heart than he probably intended it. But don't worry, I've had a lot of therapy, guys. But here's Mark. He's a happy, kind, intelligent person. He says, I'm grateful for the life I have, I'm lucky to be alive, and I'm lucky in that life. Gross. But we started dating because I wanted to keep him under strict observation. I wanted to understand how somebody could be happy and aware in the modern world. I'm gonna drink. It's just water. I remember one time we were driving out to Las Vegas to meet some of his family, and the topic of slot machines came up. I told him I'm not into gambling. I'm not a lucky person. I come from a very long line of unlucky people. I'm not gonna give away my money by pretending I'm gambling. And he thought that was really interesting. Growing up, his dad always told him they were very lucky people. They were born in a place and time that granted an unusual amount of privilege to people, security by comparison to previous generations. I mean, he had access to clean drinking water and free education. What more could you possibly want? Now, I'm the daughter of a mortician and a coroner. So we have a different view in my family. And every family holiday comes with its own story of unexpected tragedy that admittedly is kind of funny. I remember every Christmas Eve, my dad would take us out to look at the lights in the neighborhood. Like I said, this was a very kind man, but still had a good sense of humor. And sometimes those two things end up in conflict. So every Christmas Eve, he would take my brother and I driving up and down every block in our neighborhood very slowly in the coroner's van. I was young. I was having a great time. It was the 80s. You didn't have to wear a seatbelt. You could just run up and down through the van. It was great. And I always remember he would be laughing so hard that when I got a little bit older and I really started to think about it, I was like, okay, that's kind of funny. Really, the neighborhoods are all settling in for that special night, excited for the next day, and then all of a sudden the coroner's van starts slowly driving up your block. Did one of the neighbors die? Is that nice lady down the street who always watches the kids in an emergency? Or is it a jerk at the end of the block who'll turn the hose on your kids if they go into his yard? You don't know. But it definitely puts a different slant on Christmas Eve. So funny, not funny, maybe not the most virtuous act, but it was fun. It made our life more enjoyable. It definitely made my dad crack up. And this is a very specific example, but the question of balancing what is a virtuous life against what is a life I enjoy now becomes central to defining what is a good life. So let's go back to Aristotle and his concept of eudaimonia. All right, so Aristotle did put a little groundwork in here. He said, you need to be able to have access to basic human needs, food, shelter. I mean, you can't live a good life if you're always watching your family starve. Just one of those things, not enjoyable. But eudaimonia, which is often translated to mean happiness, is really more of a happiness achieved through happiness achieved virtuously. It's a way of flourishing. And according to Aristotle, it is the highest humanity, it is the highest level of good for humanity. The final of final goods. And final good is something that we pursue for its own sake, like joy or knowledge or love. To flourish is to live well or to do well, and that equates to happiness or eudaimonia. The two components of life that Aristotle would point to for those in pursuit of this good life would be function, the characteristic activity, and virtue, which is excellent performance of that function. So function, which is a characteristic activity, is thinking like, a fire burns, a knife cuts, an oven heats up, cooks food, and occasionally catches fire if it lives with me. But what is the basic human function? What is your function? Does it differ from person to person? Once again, I'm going to bring up capitalism. In this society where everything's based on market value, a lot of times when you say, oh, hi, my name's Carly, what is it you do? We are defining ourselves by our profession a lot of the time, but that's not really our human function. So, well, now I'm making a mess up here. So for Aristotle, the answer was exercise our faculties in accordance with excellence or virtue. What makes humans different from other creatures, according to him, was that we have reason and intellect. And so to be human and to perform your function, you need to consistently think and act rationally. To Aristotle, that didn't seem like a really big deal. He's not asking a lot of people here. Consistently think and act rationally. Now, I don't know if anyone would say that most people are achieving that functionality these days, but that's how we're going to continue to define it. So, the looming question, what is happiness? It's not just all thinking, right? I mean, I could think all day, every day, but I don't know if that's going to bring me happiness. I'm guessing it's not. Aristotle runs through a lot of different concepts when defining eudaimonia, this perfect happiness. Maybe pleasure yields happiness. Oftentimes pleasure is defined as just the absence of pain. What about wealth? That's a big one for this particular time. According to Aristotle, wealth is something contrary to nature, but it becomes valuable as a means to an end, not a final good, something that you're pursuing so then you can apply it to a final good. If I learned anything from DuckTales, enough gold to swim through is not going to make you happier than other people. Which is why we get to this. Like I said, I was taught it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're a good person. You lead a good life. Being good is more about the characteristics we embody. Honor, courage, honesty, authenticity, that kind of thing. Ethos actually translates to something like characteristic. So ethical behavior has something to do with those traits that define your character, right? The problem here is that your character is something that other people perceive about you. People might be talking about Jerry's tremendous courage because, after all, Jerry saved that kitten from a burning building. Of course, if Jerry set fire to the building and then ran past an old lady on his way to the fire escape, maybe not so courageous. But you might still see Jerry as courageous. It doesn't mean your perception is correct. So, I'm guessing most people in here have known a narcissist or two, right? Everybody? Okay. Try explaining to them that they're not the hero of their own story. Go ahead, try it. I'll wait. Some people have a lens through which they see the world that is totally distorted and distorts everyone and everything in their lives. They might always see their actions as warranted, as virtuous, but much like Jerry, Their self-perception and the reality that the rest of us live in is very different. Okay, so let's say there are emblematic qualities of virtue, you know, that when we embody them, we elevate the individual life to something that is good with a capital G. Now, the capital G, in case you don't know, when it is used, is taken to be a golden truth, something that should be unquestioned because it's an undeniable truth. I don't know about that. In fact, I can assure you that my set of big G values isn't going to match everybody else's. I think people are closer to the big G good when they question their inherited value system. But other people might say it's more virtuous to respect the ideas and traditions handed down over time. I would say it shows courage and strength to question those. Anyway, so my point is, knowing what is good can be elusive. It's not the same for everyone, and maybe that can't be our standard for good. So let's look at what doing good is, because it's more about the virtuous acts one does. Helping old ladies with their groceries, helping old ladies up the stairs, saving kittens from fires, that sort of thing, virtuous acts. Once again, we find ourselves with the same issues. Stealing is wrong, right? But is it more virtuous to steal from someone who has more than they can eat in order to feed a starving family? Or is it more virtuous to just watch that family suffer? I always thought I would find more people arguing in favor of theft with this one, but a lot of what I read in the news seems like people are fighting for just the opposite, right? Take away from the suffering family, give it to the person who has more than enough because they have a virtuous claim on it. They worked hard to achieve that excess, or they were unusually gifted or talented. They were smart or beautiful, whatever. That ethos, that characteristic, was imbued by the fates to grant them the privileges they enjoy. It would not be virtuous to take from the family and give it to the other, to take from that person and give it to the family, because maybe that family lacks the virtues or talents that this person has. Otherwise, they would be enjoying the same life of privilege. So, give it, take it from the rich, yeah. Anyway, the point is, being good, doing good, it all gets pretty muddled. And so, what a lot of this comes down to is the difference between ethical altruism and ethical egoism. Now, ethical altruism is good in general, greater good for greater number, whereas ethical egoism is about good for the agent, self-interest. Now, altruism, living for the sake of others, living a life of service, or as it's defined, an action that is morally correct if the result is good for those involved, except for the agent, meaning the person doing the action. Now, I know we've probably all seen somebody or been somebody or who self-sacrifices to the point of exhaustion, who gives until they have nothing left to give. That can kind of create its own problems. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, claims the moral choice is only to act in one's self-interest. It's the best option for me, so it's the best ethical option. Rational egoism, which is something a little bit different, argues that acting in one's own self-interest is the only rational course of action. That almost makes sense to me in a way that ethical egoism doesn't. You know, whether the effects on other people are detrimental, beneficial, or neutral, it doesn't really matter. I'm just tasked with living my best life. That's my function, my goal. And I can't help it if you get trampled on my journey to greatness. That's your function, bro. So, now maybe you're wondering who would think ethical egoism is in any way ethical. At least, I would imagine a group of humanists to go that way. So, let's talk about utilitarianism. The greatest good for the greatest number. First introduced in the 18th century by Jeremy Bentham, it was called Benthamism. Obviously, that's what you name it if your name is Bentham. It was John Stuart Mill, Bentham's successor, who popularized the term utilitarianism. Now, Jeremy Bentham thought he invented the word, but John Stuart Mill admitted the former gleaned it from more of a passing phrase. So what Bentham says on utilitarianism is by the principle of utility is meant the principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency it appears to have, to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. Or, what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. I say of every action whatsoever, and therefore not only of every action of a private individual, but of every measure of government. So I can get really frustrated reading philosophy. I mean, what's he trying to say there? Basically, greatest good for greatest number. Whether you're an individual or a government entity, the true focus should be on achieving the greatest good for the greatest number. And part of that's why I much prefer the work of John Stuart Mill. Mill believed that happiness is best achieved en passant, rather than as a direct pursuit. En passant means in passing. So Mill was a proponent of women's rights. He believed that liberty should support the freedom of the individual in opposition to social control or government. And he was the godfather of Bertrand Russell, who's another favorite of mine. Moreover, he supported the idea we know as market socialism, which supports social ownership of the means of production within the framework of a market economy. One interesting thing about Mill, I recently learned, is that he went through a very serious bout of depression when he was 20. He asked himself whether the creation of a just society, his life's objective, would actually make him happy. And according to him, his heart said no. Doing all of this greater good stuff might, be good, morally good, ethically required, but not like fun or enjoyable, capable of yielding happiness. And while eventually Mill found the poetry of Williams Wordsworth, which showed him the beauty that generates compassion for others and stimulates joy. Life was worth living again. Good deeds and good times are possible. Of course, I have to mention, he was also an outspoken advocate for the colonialization of England at that time. In fact, he spent his entire professional career as a colonial administrator at the East India Company. He did that for 35 years. So that's going to bring us to our next slide, how we address the difference between the philosopher and the philosophy. I'm sure we've all heard, how do you address the separation of the art from the artist? As with John Stuart Mill, we have some great ideas and some piss-poor execution. Emancipation for women, yes. Market socialism, sounds like fun. British colonialism, wait. Yeah, so as mentioned, with Mill being a staunch supporter of the British occupation of India, he believed it was ethical to impose governance in the form of benevolent despotism, provided the end is improvement. That certainly puts a different slant on utilitarianism. So we'll go back to his predecessor, good old Jeremy Bentham. Remember greatest good, greatest number? Yeah. So that guy had it written that upon his passing, he was to become the auto icon. The auto icon consists of Bentham's preserved skeleton, dressed in his own clothes, and surmounted by a head of wax. His head, obviously. Bentham requested that his body be preserved in this way in his will, which he made shortly before he died in 1832. Now, some will say it was the ultimate act of utilitarianism. Bentham didn't want to waste his corpse by allowing it to rot away. He had a much more useful idea, one that would create greater good for a greater number. I mean, people can learn something from the dissection and preservation of a body, right? That's better than burial, right? Yeah. Bentham wrote there were actually 11 uses for his auto icon. including lucrative, as in money-making, theatrical, and agricultural. Now, unfortunately, he didn't go into a lot of detail for every intended use, which is a shame, because I have a lot of questions. Of course, few really felt that Bentham was acting for the greater good at his insistence on the auto icon. Karl Marx called him a genius of bourgeois stupidity. And in her paper, A Logical Absurdity, Jeremy Bentham and the Auto Icon, Anna Breton Brawley says, through self-preservation, Bentham has demonstrated that, even in the age of reason, human idiosyncrasies prevented a complete divorce between reason and absurdity. So, the point I'm trying to make here is that philosophers don't always live in accordance with their philosophical views. Sometimes they think they are embodying a moral concept, only to have history look at them and point to a blind spot. Martin Heidegger is a great example of that. So, that brings us to humanism, a term that has changed a lot throughout history, and as it's been claimed by different philosophical movements. Humanists, in case you didn't know, are naturalistic in their understanding of the universe and believe that acting in a moral way is the only way for humans to advance. Doing good means practical action to improve personal and social conditions, according to Andrew Clopson's definition. Now, I won't read you the International Humanists and Ethical Union explanation of a humanist, because that feels a little bit like mansplaining, but I will say a humanist approach is going to be very key as we move forward. So, that brings us to moral imperative. What is a moral imperative? Well, Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher and one of the central thinkers of the Enlightenment period, presented a doctrine of transcendental idealism, amongst other things. Morality, according to Kant, is the ultimate commandment of reason. An imperative is any proposition that is deemed necessary. So morality is an imperative when one seeks to live a good life, according to Kant and me. Kant said, I ought never act except in a way that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. I think that's a rather grandiose way of stating the golden rule again, but I'm super into it. I like it. I'm here for it. So, as humanists, as human beings, we must conduct ourselves in a way we see as moral in order to arrive at a meaningful existence. So what makes optimism a moral imperative? And as humanists, we must see effective and practical solutions to the problems that currently plague humans. I mean, how can we do good in a world, live a good life with all that entails, if we just see ourselves on a collision course with the end of times? No, philosophers and science fiction writers alike have a responsibility to envision a better future. And if you, like me, take issue with distribution of value or resources in modern society, maybe you see dismantling some of those big G good human ideas that lots of folks have struggled to gain over time. It becomes an imperative to maintain hope if you want to be able to contribute hope. Otherwise, we're all nihilists, like this kitten here. Now, I'm not here to argue the merits of nihilism independently. No, I want to focus on the effectiveness of nihilism in achieving the good life that Aristotle wrote about. If you view morality as meaningless and progress as pointless, it can lead to indifference, malaise, and of course, an existential crisis. No, to be effective, we need to learn how to foster resilience in the face of opposition. Okay. Which brings us back to Bertrand Russell. I'd like to read you something from the postscript in Russell's autobiography. He said, "I have lived in the pursuit of a vision, both personal and social. Personal is to care for what is noble or what is beautiful, for what is gentle, to allow moments of insight to give wisdom at more mundane times. Social is to see in imagination the society that is to be created, where individuals grow freely and where hate and greed and envy die because there is nothing to nourish them. These things, I believe, and the world, for all its horrors, has left me unshaken." We talk a lot about Nazis these days. People love to throw around the word. And as someone who was raised to fear the return of Nazis, I don't think it's unwarranted. Not just because we're dealing with people who cheer when a billionaire broski throws a Nazi salute. There's some real scary stuff happening in the world today. But I'll keep saying it. It's hard to remain hopeful. But I challenge you to think about Russell's end-of-life reflection again. The man lived through the actual rise of Nazis and the death of millions upon millions of individuals. These things, I believe, and the world, for all its horrors, has left me unshaken. That, to me, should be the rallying cry of humanists and do-gooders all around the world. I remain unshaken. All right, let's go back to this guy. So that brings me to something known as the happiness advantage. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with that. But if you can raise the positivity in your brain, you can hit what they call the happiness advantage. We perform better at positive than at negative, neutral, or stressed. Intelligence, creativity, energy levels, they all rise when you have a positive outlook. You become 31% more productive. And you become more resilient. You avoid burnout. And I think one of the biggest things we deal with as people who are trying to do good in the world is feeling like it's not effective, it's not getting you anywhere. You start to burn out. Even if you're not physically burned out from working super hard all the time and carrying water to homeless people, doing these tasks to make the world better, we become emotionally, psychologically exhausted. I recommend everybody take a break from the news for a day or two. Being positive does not mean being ignorant of the world around you. That's why we have Mark. It's not necessarily the reality that shapes us, but the lens through which your brain views the world that shapes your reality. Now, Sean Archer said that. He is a professor. He's done a lot of public speaking on the topic of positivity. Like I said, I hate toxic positivity. If somebody's going to come at me with it, all I'm going to do is want to hit them. But I would say I have a very positive outlook on the future, which is funny to me, clearly, because it is such a dire time in human history. But that's why it becomes important to envision a better world. What does it look like, and how do we get there? Now, I don't want to hear about clearing out all the riffraff through human hunger or war or despair. I've heard it all before. What else could happen? Now, I'm not asking you, once again, to be naive of the very real danger we as a species might be facing. No, trading awareness for positivity is where you get to toxic positivity. That's not what we're shooting for today. We live in a society that places everything on market value. We're told happiness comes after success. But that's actually completely untrue. Every time you succeed, you're moving the goalpost. How many of you have experienced that where, I got this done and now I'm like, well, there's another thing. It delays that sense of success, of completion. We never really arrive at it. It is a carrot we are continually chasing. So, I don't even know how many times I went through this cycle before I started to see that it was even happening. I overcame a challenge, I got a new challenge, it was a bigger challenge, And this is what I like to think creates the Dragon Ball lifestyle. For those of you who are not familiar with Japanese anime, quite all right. Every time a monster is defeated, you get a bigger monster until he is literally fighting gods, and then like a big G type god, he wins. But for me, seeing a new world come into being means seeing a way beyond the modes of capitalism that we're currently living in. Does that mean communism? No, not necessarily. I'm not totally opposed or anything. I just want an effective means of change. So it's important to evaluate what you're doing. Think about what you're envisioning. Think about what steps you would take to live a life in accordance with that world you're seeing. And then look again. What does your vision of a better world look like, and how do we get there? Okay. So evaluate your reach. This is a huge one. Because it's about what you can actually do. And a lot of us feel like our efforts are futile because we don't have enough reach in this world to affect actual change. At least that's how we think of it. But let's go to the next question, which is, how do you live your change? Don't be like the philosophers. Don't make an auto icon of yourself. For me, for example, when I look at the problems of the world, I tend to think, well, we should move away from this rapid consumerism, all this mindless internet spending. We end up supporting these really bad companies who do really bad things. I feel like we need to focus on communities. In the 1980s, 1% of people responded to a survey saying they didn't have a friend. They didn't have somebody they could call if they had a problem or if they needed help. That number is now 17%. That is an epidemic of isolation. So, how do you live your change? Well, sorry. For me, I decided to build a cemetery. Clearly. We're working on building one in Tempe right now for cremation only, for ethical, affordable, environmental death care options, which the funeral industry is very much behind on, and perhaps not the best industry in the world. But for me, I saw a way to act for change that was within my reach. And then you have to look at it again. How do you gauge your success? Am I living a good life? If you don't know how to be happy, it is actually something that can be learned. I found that out myself. So seriously, and this is where it gets weird. And my 19-year-old self would be absolutely horrified about this list that I have here. But it's been scientifically substantiated that you can start shifting to a positive outlook without sacrificing awareness of the world. If you do certain things like gratitude journaling, think of 3 things that you're thankful for. Journaling in general can help. Exercise, and I say this both as somebody who's interested in philosophy of optimism and also a death care professional. 30 minutes of walking 3 times a week will change your whole outlook on the world. It, once again, studied, scientifically substantiated. Meditation and random kindness. Now, practicing kindness in the world is something that I would assume most people in this room are trying to do pretty regularly. But it is an act of kindness without an expected return. When you're evaluating not only your reach, but your effectiveness, sometimes the things that we do are little more than virtue signaling. We've maybe all heard of the phrase greenwashing. I want to make a more environmental choice. I'm going to recycle these things at my home. And then we find out that recycling isn't being sent anywhere. Then it becomes an act of greenwashing. And we need to look at those things to see what is actually changing things in our own lives, not for the world as a whole, but like, how do I live in accordance with the world I want to see? So, once again, how do we see our way past capitalism? So for me, that ends up being a lot of acting in accordance with this view. Once you challenge yourself to start imagining a better world, and then you start thinking about how would you live in that world? What would your days be like? We were able to acquire a very old piece of Arizona with a house from the 1800s, and I laugh because I learned what it's like to live in the 1800s. There are no dishwashers, I gotta say. I am a modern girl in a modern world, and sometimes I'm horrified by the chores. But it's a means to an end. I am trying to see what I think would improve society and then live in accordance with that way. But as I mentioned before, a lot of my ethical philosophy focused in on ethical business practices, because that is a way that I can see capitalism shifting to support a more just society. I stepped into the company I currently run about 6 or 7 years ago, and there were certain changes that I made right out the gate. Everyone who had a salary that was high at the top got bumped down. Everybody who was low got bumped up. Anytime we rise as a company and we enjoy an increase in profitability, that is something that is shared throughout. If there's a year where things are a little sparse, the only people who get raises are the people at the lowest level of the pay scale, because it's hardest to adjust to cost of living changes when you have a lower income than somebody else. I also have applied this to other things like contractual obligations. I don't know how this cleaning company got me, but I swear to God, they put me on a 3-year contract. So once that contract renews, it's automatic. And you'll see these practices. I'm sure we all have cell phones, dear God. Could you even, God, G-A-W-D. Anyway, can you even imagine, what these contracts look like over time? There's so much that gets put into these things that makes it seem like a little shady. So with our company, when we have clients, they're under no contract for continuing services. We just try and offer the best thing that we can, and we find that 95% of our clients are going to remain with our continuing service offerings without any contract. I also believe in fostering cooperation over competition, which is a very big shift in the funeral industry. I would say we make something called a columbarium. And so with other columbarium suppliers in the country, that is actually sort of a unit for reposing cremated remains that are in urns. So you have an urn, place it sort of in a wall that has its own granite facing stone. And there's only so many suppliers of this around the country. I was very, very surprised that we weren't all friends. So we went to a couple of industry conventions, found out when you use words like environmental or affordable, people will actually boo in the room. So when they found out what we did, some people were like outright rude about it. I was surprised. So the next year we came back with hundreds and hundreds of shirts that say, "We can't save your soul, but we can save your ash." We try to foster those conversations between different companies. So now we're friends with everybody. My competitors have our stickers on their water bottle. Trying to move away from predatory practices, from contractual obligations that are unjust, fostering cooperation over competition, those were my ways of seeing a better world and trying to identify a way that I get there. What do I have to do to get us over a line in our individual lives? Because doing good is going to change for everybody, because we all have a different outlook. But there's a general idea in our lives of what that looks like, and we really need to start exercising that imagination to see pathways to a better world. So grassroots organizations, another great option when you're creating that vision of how do I get from here to there. Community involvement, fostering relationships between individuals, fostering random acts of kindness in the form of community involvement. These are all exceptional modes of starting to actualize what that better future looks like. Because when we're constantly assaulted by all of these horrors in the world, it's so easy to fall into despair. It takes an exercise of intellect to try and look at it optimistically, to embrace a framework of hope so that we can say, no matter the horrors of the world, I remain unshaken. So.
So we do have time for questions. All right.
Thank you. Carly, thanks so much for being here. I'm so fascinated and intrigued. You get this mandate or this email, this invite as a sci-fi writer to flip it up. What were the first 3 thoughts you had? And then also, what did you envision? Like, did you have illustrations come to mind? Because I've never even thought about that, and then you brought it to this room, and I was like, oh my gosh, what did she do with this?
Yeah, you know, it takes a lot of dismantling. I got to say, when you first start out, it is an exercise. Like I said, I have a phobia of public speaking rather than a fear. I had a fear of rodents. I know it sounds weird, but it was debilitating, and it actually became a problem because I was living in the Bay, and I don't know if you know about rodents, but man, I saw a rat the size of a cat almost gave me a heart attack, and I would have died right there on the street. And I said, okay, this is annoying. It's not really a big problem, but it is a problem. So I started going to the pet store every day, and I would just stand there for a few minutes in front of the rodent cages, just until the fear started to subside. I don't like them. I don't want them around. But at least I don't freeze or feel like I'm dying when I see one. Public speaking is a phobia. That means I can't dismantle it. I obviously do a lot of public speaking, so maybe I hide it better, but, you know, husband brought me my water for a very obvious reason. You know, but when I first saw this, it was a bit overwhelming. I tried to start thinking, you know, I have all these ideas. I've written these novels about things going a little bit worse or a lot worse, and trying to use the imagination to think of something better. I start going to books like Thomas More's Utopia, you know, these books that we've seen who are presenting a utopian world, and they're problematic as well. So it became an ongoing exercise. It was something that I needed to practice. I needed to start thinking, okay, well, capitalism is bad, but I'm not going off grid. So let's take a look at what I can do in the world around me. And that became, let's structure the business a little bit different. Let's structure my approach a little bit differently. It was these small shifts so that I could develop that muscle and then really start to think about, okay, well, maybe if we encourage people to make their own things a little bit more, maybe they'll spend a little bit less. So at our home, we do classes on, you know, we'll make some candles, we'll infuse honey, we'll knit a hat. I mean, whatever it is, just these simple practices, somebody might find something they enjoy, and it means they're selling, you know, one less hat on Amazon. So.
Carly, thank you very much. Great presentation. Recently, National Public Radio and some of the PBS talking head shows have been discussing the fact that old-time evangelists like Billy Graham and a lot of others back in that day were very much in favor of promoting compassion and empathy. And it seems now it's not just Elon Musk and greedy billionaires, who are saying that empathy is the worst characteristic or trait that a person can have, and it's going to be the ruin of civilization, especially Western civilization. So my question is, how do we go from a position where 20, 25, 30 years ago, religious leaders were really trying to promote empathy and compassion to the point now where you're looked at as not just a sucker, but for someone who is really trying to destroy America with compassion and empathy? Thank you very much.
That's a great question. You know, so much of what we're told the world is like is not what the world is like. So much of what we read in the media, I mean, starting with, yellow journalism, I'm sure it went before that as well, but this fear-mongering, this idea that you're foolish if you're compassionate. A lot of people will say something like, people just aren't good anymore, or most people I know are pretty selfish or greedy or something like that. And usually my first question is, yeah? Like who? Like who in your life? Like if you had to name the people in your life, how many of them really suck? Like how many of them are bad people? Versus how many of them do you think would want to do good in the world? We're fed fear so that we start thinking, I just need enough for my family. I just need to secure my future. I need a security level that somehow acquiring wealth, acquiring resources, that's going to fulfill that. And so big business, which includes media, oftentimes pushes that narrative as well. But when we bring it down to a more individual and community level, you find that you're actually surrounded by a lot of good people, and that becomes your resource. If I suddenly, put all my money into an ancient property and then end up living on a barge with my husband, that sounds great, actually. That sounds just fine by me. I have a community around me. If I needed to stay on somebody's couch, I have a place I can go. It's a different approach, and certainly not one that's going to be supported by big business. So it's about shifting away from them and acknowledging that that's just not true. But it is hard in the face of modernity.
Thank you again, Carly, for inspiring and fascinating talk. I agree with your suggestions and those of the philosophers about how we should conduct our lives virtuously and individually to improve our community. And that's, in fact, of course, what HSGP is all about, building community at the local level. But I'm still trying to figure out, how do we take this advice to try to affect change at the national level? We're discouraged, and in a way, it's sort of easy to retreat and say, okay, we'll just have our little community and ignore what's going out there. But we can't ignore it. How do we conduct a virtuous life and also try to affect change beyond just our community?
This is one moment where you evaluate your reach. There are a lot of things, we can do things like get a group together and send postcards to representatives. Just mail bomb their office. Not a bomb. I meant like a lot of postcards. That's what I meant. Okay, yeah. The thing is that when you're affecting change in a small community, it has an echo. If somebody can see successes in what you're doing here in Phoenix area, they might try to replicate that model elsewhere. If we have more people who are having conversations about things going on in the world and identifying problems there, we're having less people find that place of isolation. Cornel West has said, we're either educating allies or alienating enemies. And that's brutal, I gotta say. That one's really hard to take, especially because family gatherings, there's gonna be that uncle. And you're just gonna be like, I don't know about this. Should I say something? Should I not say something? And having those conversations at that small level, suddenly we have somebody who's voting differently. We have somebody questioning the narrative that the world is a bad place and it's headed towards destruction and there's nothing you can do about it. Trying to go for a national level of change is always a great thing, but you have to evaluate that pathway and see what you're doing, because oftentimes we're more effective in the community that we're living in. and then we try to echo that out.
Speaking about questioning the narrative, you keep banging away on capitalism. Is there no level of capitalism that's not bad, or are you just speaking about like oligarchy and peasants? And I'd like to remind you that as a entrepreneur and business owner, you are a capitalist.
Oh, totally, 100%. Let's get that
And,
right
and,
on the.
and for the economics, what would you suggest then in order to try to maximize benefits, goods, products, services that can be shared by all people and improve people's lives? Because it doesn't work in communism and it doesn't work with state level socialism.
Oh, I totally understand where you're coming from. And I agree with you. There are ideas about ethical capitalism that have value. That is actually what I'm trying to do, is create an ethical model for business that operates within a capitalistic system. It's not necessarily about a revolutionary shift away. We saw a lot of that in the 20th century. People are going to be like, this is bad, let's all jump to communism. And we know that maybe some problems arose. It's not about a sudden dismantling, especially when you're trying to see a way forward. For me, I think if we're trying to imagine a better world, we don't necessarily want a violent revolution to be the step we have to take. And something like capitalism is easy to point to because of how it's sort of run amok, and it's creating this large income disparity. So it's an easy one to point to and say this is a problem. But there are modes of ethical capitalism, and if we can approach those as a community or as an individual entrepreneur, it's a way of restructuring things that still achieves that ethical balance, but you don't have to totally negate an entire economic system. It's about finding out what works, evaluating it, and then moving on. I run a business. I have employees. I structured it a little bit differently because I'm not trying to get all the money at the top of that company. I can't imagine how people go to work and they're working with these people and they're paying them so significantly less that they're struggling to get by. Knowing that you're in an office with somebody who can't afford to go to the dentist, you got to look at your life, man. I mean, but when it comes to something like this, these smaller changes that I can affect in my community, in my own life, it echoes. So establishing a model that maybe takes a different approach on some topics. I've talked a lot about, to move away from capital, I talked a lot about blind hiring. I guess we're not supposed to say DEI these days, but there's a lot of opportunities there. I do what we call blind hiring, which means when I get resumes or we have a position to fill, names, locations, all of that stuff gets wiped out, and we just look at the rest of the resume. What have they done? Where have they worked? What is their experience? And then when my team looks at it, that's what they're looking at. So they don't know what this person's name is, don't know if it's a man or a woman, or where they come from. There's all these different elements at play that people will subconsciously make decisions about, whether they realize it or not, and it ends up impacting who we hire. But I will tell you, if you take the names off, your office will integrate real fast, because you're looking at the individual skill set, their experience. It changes, and it's a small thing. It's not even a capitalist thing, but it is a more ethical approach to doing business, in my opinion.
This is not a question. I just wanted to compliment you on the beautiful slides. Everybody, I guarantee everybody in here loved those slides. They're the best slides that we've seen in forever, so thank you for that.
Kittens and Mark, we're trying to promote optimism, right?
Hey, Carly, one other question. You are passionate about little gardens. Tell us more, please.
I'm trying. The thing is that I'm actually a merchant of death. I have a very distinct black thumb, but I am trying. We have the land that we have right off of University, just on the other side of the 101, is an old strip of agricultural land. And the trees have been there for more than a century. It's on old flood irrigation rights. And so we want to maintain the integrity of the grounds and the hydrology of the land, which means I'm doing a lot of reading about how to not kill things. And it actually means that my office manager is going to step in on my behalf because we had a rough season. But I love the idea of gardening, you know, producing food here locally, understanding that sort of food chain, being able to kind of expand upon it. I ended up giving Mark chickens for Valentine's Day one year. I thought it was great. But we actually, you know, we're attached. We're attached to those. He's attached to those chickens, and you know, just being involved in something really simple like, you know, we get eggs, and you know, we're two people, so we give away a lot of eggs. You know, and then you see other people are like, well, I should get some chickens, or I should grow something, and then it's shifting that narrative. Now we have, it's not a lot, but you know, less money spent at a grocery store that's not local, access to food that we're taking care of ourselves. So gardening has become an interest of mine as a means to an end. It is not the final good, thank God, but it's definitely something that I see as something that could be important or help change these individual experiences that we're having in the world around us.
Fantastic. So I see one hand here, and then we got just a couple more minutes for questions.
I'm on your dollar, man.
I happened to notice on one of your slides that you had the Vulcan salute. Are you a Star Trek fan?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I don't want to go into that too much here because it'll get awkward real fast. Star Trek is actually the calming show I watch at the end of the day. Now, I have watched Breaking Bad, I will admit. But I will say when I first started it, they had to turn it off because I would yell at the TV. You are making the wrong decision. I get very angry at fiction, apparently. Star Trek is kind of like my answer to that. I like that it's a different world, a different structure. It helps me think of better tomorrows, and I'm glad my parents watched it when I was younger.
The reason I mentioned that is because I worked on the show. But
We just became best friends.
the next gen, I didn't work on the original.
That was the one I grew up with.
Good. Makes me feel young.
Still growing up, it's fine.
Okay. I'm stuck with the mic now.
Okay, I don't see any more hands raised. I think everybody is pleasantly sated by a wonderful presentation, except I have one thing. I'm currently reading G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica, which is shall we say, a critique of both Bentham and Mill. So,
Do they talk about the auto icon?
yes, we do. So, thank you so much for an excellent, excellent presentation. Please give a warm welcome. Thank you. Are you able to stick around for a couple minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So fantastic. So I think Catherine is going to let me know when we're out of stream. Well, we don't have a stream. We're just recording. Okay, fantastic.